Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop, all the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're going to be talking about ability-focused inclusion for people with disabilities. And my guest is a very well-known advocate for those with disabilities. Her name is Rachna Sizemore Heizer. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Catherine. I appreciate it.
So you are known, you belong to a lot of organizations. You do a lot of advocacy work here in Fairfax County.
I do. I started my advocacy work really around the education system and also in the workforce in terms of looking at inclusion with people with disabilities, both within our education system and in our workforce. But I've expanded my advocacy to community services, supports, really anywhere where I can send the message that we need to start including people with disabilities as a normative part of the human experience. And whatever that means in all aspects of life, from the time they're in preschool till the time they are adults and living in the world.
And you've gotten opportunities recently to speak in front of larger audiences, including Netroots Nation.
That was fantastic.
But backing up even before Netroots Nation, you really had an aha moment about how events, even those who purport to be inclusive, have big blind spots.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I started this journey with my son because my son has autism, and I noticed very early on in the school system that inclusion was talked about, but it wasn't really done in a way that focused on what can the kids with disabilities do and how do we include them around their strengths, around their abilities. And that's where it first hit me that we don't really look at people with disabilities for their strengths. We don't look at them as part of human experience. And then, fast forward many years, and I was at the Women's March right after the election, and there was hours of speeches. I don't know if you were there.
I was there.
I figured
Tom
you were
and I
there.
were both there.
And there were hours of these really passionate speeches, and the theme really was about we are different than those who have just been elected. We are inclusive. We value everybody. And every speaker got up there said, you know, we include people of color. We include Muslims and Hispanics and African Americans
and LGBT,
and women, and we're intersectional and all of these great things. And I started counting on my fingers the number of times disability was mentioned in that list of diversity. And it was, I don't think I got to both hands. And that was in 3 hours of speeches. And I thought, wait a second, there is a huge blind spot in our society. And this might be why, you know, there's only about a 35% employment rate for people with disabilities. And this might be why we have, you know, 60% of kids with disabilities not graduating with standard high school diplomas. And it's because we have a blind spot towards viewing disability as part of the rest of us.
It's not normative.
It's not normative. It's kind of the other, right?
Right, and so now we've got conferences, so fast forward 2 years to this summer.
So that's, yeah, that was the
You were invited to speak on disability advocacy at Netroots, which is a progressive conference. They actually, when you submit your panel and your proposal, they want to be diverse. How many women? Are there people in the LGBT community? Are there people of color? And they really take pride in being inclusive and being representative. But that's not what you found when you got there.
Well, you know, it was really interesting because I noticed this at Women's March and I started talking about it. And, you know, I thought, all right, this is a year and a half later. There's been a lot of what I call awakening of the progressive spirit since the election. And I thought going to Netroots, which is this, you know, renowned national progressive conference, I would see more of the things that I've been looking for. And it first hit me when I realized mine was the only disability-focused training or panel out of like 175 panels. And I thought, well, that's unusual. You would think disability. And then on top of that, when I went to the conference, I realized there was really no talk of disability as diversity. We had these amazing keynote speakers and panels and plenary speakers. I mean, we had Kamala Harris and all these people, and they'd get up there again, like the Women's March. It felt like the same thing, and talk about being inclusive of you know, people of color and LGBT and so on and so forth.
The full spectrum of Americans, right?
The full spectrum of American diversity.
Right. American diversity.
And the whole first day, disability was never mentioned. It was only mentioned one time by any of the keynote or plenary speakers. And that was from the woman running for the governor of New Mexico, mentioned disability in her laundry list of diversity.
Right.
And I thought, my goodness, if they don't even see disability as part of their inclusive diversity at a progressive conference, where are we in society with true inclusion of disability? Where are we in seeing people with disabilities as our hairdressers, as our doctors, as our teachers? We don't, when we think of hairdressers and doctors, we do now think of women and men and LGBT and people of color in those roles. And I would like to think most of us don't think anything of it when we have a woman doctor, which used to be unusual, or a male hairdresser, or whatever the stereotypes used to be. But I don't think anybody really thinks about, wow, where is my hairdresser in a wheelchair?
Right.
Where is my teacher in a wheelchair? Nobody blinks an eye when there isn't one.
Right. And so you're talking too about both physical disabilities, and that's the one. So there were people at Netroots who were in wheelchairs.
There were.
And you could see their disability. But there are other people who were at Netroots who had like cognitive disabilities, and you can't see those. So sometimes you might be talking to somebody who is on a spectrum.
Yeah, who might be on the autism spectrum.
Right.
But you don't know. And so, it is hard to know, are they being inclusive of disability? But, one of the things I noticed at Netroots that hit me right away is they had this booklet all about information about the conference and all the panels. And in the front of the booklet, they talked about having a room for people of color to be able to sort of get together and talk, and kind of a safe space for people of color to discuss whatever issues or thoughts or this and that. But they didn't have a sensory space. Now, autism, a lot of people with autism have sensory issues and need kind of a quiet space to sit and kind of get away from the crowds and then re-engage and then get away from the crowds. And in the autism community, this is very well known, the kind of hypersensory needs of some people on the spectrum. But there was no sensory space at the conference. And when I mentioned it to some of the conference organizers, they were very open to the concept of it, but it was like they never even understood the thought of it. Right. They had no idea what that meant. There was no ADA coordinator for the conference.
Yeah, that was kind of surprising because there were 3,000 people. It's the largest one they've ever had.
Yeah.
3,000 people at a conference, but there was not an ADA coordinator.
Well, and I tweeted out about some of these issues, and some of the people who were there who were in wheelchairs talked about how they found it very inaccessible. Even my own talk, my presentation on disability
was the farthest end of a long hallway from the elevator.
It was the furthest away from the elevator, and none of it was done deliberately. There was no intent. I get that, right? But it was so not thought about. Who would put a disability training at the furthest end? But even the one that really hit me was there was a statement in the Netroots booklet about being safe from harassment, right? This is a safe place to exchange ideas, and we're safe for harassment, and we value the opinions, and again, that laundry list, right, of people, LGBT, and people of color, Muslims, and immigrants, and so on, and they only listed physical limitations in there, as if, and the way it was talked about, it's a limitation, as opposed to people of differing abilities, people who, and there was no recognition of cognitive, sensory, communication disabilities. And you sat there, and I sat there at this progressive conference, and I didn't hear disability mentioned, except for when I did mention where's the disability, I was pointed to the fact there was a healthcare panel.
Ah, yes. Now we get to the models.
Now we get to the models of disability, right? And I thought, well, that's great. There's a healthcare panel, and obviously access to healthcare and protecting Medicaid and expanding Medicaid is a very important issue with people with disabilities. And the ACA and having an ability to buy insurance is very important. But that's kind of the basics, right? Like if you're telling somebody with a disability, hey, we see you, look, we're talking about your healthcare, really the message you're sending is, the only time we're really thinking about your needs is we want to make sure you don't die.
Right.
Which is important, right?
But it's the most basic.
It's the most basic
thing. It's a basic survival. We need to make sure that you are adequately housed, fed, supported, that you're not in danger to yourself, that you're
not dead.
Right.
Right. I mean, how would it feel to you if I said, Catherine, you're not dead, great, I'm done with you. Right, which is of course not what they were saying, but that's kind of, when we think about disability, we do think about what's known in the world, but what I would call either the charity model of disability or the medical model of disability, right? And the charity model of disability says we look at people with disabilities and we say, how do we take care of you? How do we take care of you? It's not, how are you part of my world? How are you, part of my friend group or my work group or whatever? It's how do we make sure that you're fed, that you're housed, that
you're included. I mean, and then when we talk about inclusiveness, this is about putting people in our communities, which is why the Justice Department wanted institutions to be dismantled, and for people to live to the fullest possible their ability to be in a community with other people, in a larger community with other people.
But the reality is, when we look at the charity model, we don't really talk about what are we doing to make sure you're at the bar? What do we make sure you're at the restaurant? We're just talking about, are we taking care of you? right? Whether it's in your community home or not, the thought really isn't, are you in my community?
Right. And then asking people what they're capable of doing, because this is the other thing, is that we have such low expectations. You talk about this all the time. Low expectations that really are patronizing to a large extent about our assumptions about what people with any kind of disability are capable of doing.
Well, that's the thing that really gets me, and I think that's where these charity models and medical models come from, right? The medical model is really, we look at disability as you are disabled by your medical condition, so we need to help you with your medical condition, whatever that might be. And the patronizing low expectations, which I have seen throughout the years with my son, whether it's from a special ed teacher or a general ed teacher, you know, he's, as you know, is a brilliant musician. Right. But so many of the times when I would tell people, hey, he can play the guitar, they looked at me like, yeah, sure he can. Maybe he can strum it. And I'm like, no, he can play you Jimi Hendrix.
Right.
And people wouldn't believe it. But the patronizing low expectation comes out of the fact that we as society don't generally subscribe to the social model of disability. And the social model of disability says people with disabilities are more disabled by the stereotypes and thoughts of people in the society they live in than they are by the condition of their disability, or the manifestation of their disability. So I'll give you my son as an example. My son has autism. Very common with kids with autism and adults with autism is what's called stimming.
Right.
Right. When people, sometimes their sensory systems might be overloaded or they're a little stressed or anxious, they start doing what's called repetitive behavior. And with some people, it's echolalia, which they're talking to themselves or repeating things that they've memorized from TV or wherever, and it's just repeating things that may not make sense to us in the moment. Other people, it's repetitive movements like this, right? That's their normative way of being. It is not actually harming anybody physically. It's not getting in anybody's way. It's a normative way of being, but our society doesn't see that as a normative way of being. So we see somebody out on the street walking around doing this, and we think they're strung out on drugs. We think something's wrong with them. We think, and this happened to a kid where he was standing in a park stimming, he was just doing this, and a police officer pulled up next to him and said to him, "What are you doing?" And the kid actually said, "I'm stimming." And the police officer thought he was strung out on drugs, and the incident ended up with the officer tackling him.
And this is a problem because these incidents escalate when law enforcement or other kinds of people in positions of authority don't recognize this behavior.
Exactly.
And so when we come back from our break, we're going to continue to talk with Rachna about the ways in which we perceive disability and the ways in which we need all of us to be more inclusive. So please join us after the break.
I surrender, I surrender.
All right, pal. Get ready for the day, buddy.
Hey, Dad. Hey, Dad. Do we have a gun?
What's that?
Do we have a gun?
Maybe you can make retirement happen. After all, you made this vacation happen.
Double points with every purchase?
Cleverly merging promotions.
Love it.
Cross-referencing travel sites. And booking all your flights with those...
Vouchers. I got us bumped.
They were like, oh. But now they're like... Aloha. You aced this vacation. Now get the tips you need to get on track at aceyourretirement.org.
I tried Oxy at a couple of parties. I thought I had it under control. I didn't know it'd be this addictive. I didn't know how far I'd go to get more.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth.
What to expect when you're expecting.
Like here?
A teenager.
Today, I'm going to show you how to teen-proof your home. First step, hide the car keys. Preferably somewhere they would never look. Challenges will come up. Be ready for them. Hi, honey.
Ready for the... Mom, you don't use mannequins in the mannequin challenge.
You don't have to know it all to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care will love you just the same.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. I'm talking with Rachna Sizemore Heizer about ability-focused inclusion for people with disabilities. And when we went to our break, we were talking about how oftentimes just being a person, particularly people who have either limited verbal skills or behaviors that are misinterpreted can be in danger.
They can be, and that's when you talk about the social model of disability, that's what it means, is that our perceptions and stereotypes in society are disabling people more than their actual disability. And the example I was using was with a kid with autism or adult with autism who stims, repetitive behavior. In society, misinterpreting that behavior as either being strung out on drugs or just weird or odd. And the incident where a law enforcement officer actually tackled and arrested a kid when he was standing out just kind of flipping a string over and over again. He was stimming, and he even told the officer he was stimming, but there was no understanding on the officer's part
what that
meant. And it's a normative part of being autistic. There is nothing wrong with it any more than someone twisting a pen. And that's the societal model of disability, is that unless we in society expand our definition of normal, unless we start thinking of disability as diversity and these behaviors are just part of the normative experience, we are going to disable people with disabilities and keep them out of employment and on social services. It's not just law enforcement. It's not just danger situations. That's kind of the basic, right? But workforce, where you talk about unemployment is something 60 to 70%.
It's super high.
It's super. With autism, it's more like 80%. And one of the biggest reasons is actually not lack of job skills. I actually do a training. I've done it for several government agencies, Department of Justice and IRS, on neurodiversity, on behavioral accommodations for people with neurological and behavioral disabilities. And it's not just autism, it's ADHD, it's PTSD, right, anxiety. And one of the biggest things I talk about in my training is that in the workforce, people with disabilities aren't unemployed because they don't have skills. They're unemployed because their coworkers or their customers judge their behaviors as incapable, as odd, as weird, right? One of the examples at DOJ actually was interesting. They would talk about their interview process, and I would point out in their interview process all the places somebody with a behavioral disability couldn't manage. They may have great skills, but a personality test for someone with autism who has communication and social differences isn't going to pass a personality test. One of the things they told me there was that one of the questions they ask as a group when they're hiring somebody is, would I want to spend 4 hours on the plane with them? And I said, well, what does that have to do with the job? Right. Unless the job is accompanying you on the airplane wherever you go, why are you judging somebody's ability to do a job based on their communication skills? When I talk about ability-focused inclusion, they were not looking at that person for their ability to do the work they're looking for. They were looking at that person for their ability to be a buddy. And someone with autism who might have communication, either limitations or differences, may not be a buddy in the way that they wanted them, and that shouldn't limit that person from getting a job. And that also fits into the societal model of disability. That person was excluded from a job because the society in which that job existed, in this case the Department of Justice, didn't accept that person as part of that normative society, disabled them from that job.
So let's talk about how with younger people we seem to be making some inroads. First of all, there's a very high number, I think this was one of your statistics, that 1 in 58 8-year-olds in Northern Virginia is on the autism spectrum.
Actually, it's 1 in 58 8-year-olds across the country.
Across the country.
Across the country, yeah.
So they're in public schools, and we're trying to eliminate segregating them into separate classes, and there's a lot more effort to mainstream them or do classes that are team taught. The benefit is to both the student who might have a cognitive disability, but it's also a benefit to the neurotypical children in that classroom to understand they're simply differing abilities, which us boomers in the workplace
don't always
never experienced. No, we were always segregated in our education, in our early career. We were always segregated from people with disabilities.
If we're going to talk about diversity as valuable, right, and we talk about diversity as valuable because we say that people from diverse backgrounds, whether it's race, LGBT, gender, socioeconomic, whatever, bring a creativity and a wealth of experience that comes from that background, right? If we're going to talk about that, well, disability has to fall into that category, right? And yeah, you're right. In the elementary schools, we're doing a better job of quote unquote mainstreaming, but we're still not really doing what I call ability-focused inclusion and mainstreaming, right?
Because they keep focusing on trying to fix the weakness, which almost eliminates every bit of time to cultivate the strength. Is that not a simplification?
Well, it's actually really what's happening. There's two things that happen. One, they look at mainstreaming as only academic. If you can manage the academics, we're going to stick you in the regular classroom. But if you can't manage the academics, we're going to pull you out, right? And sometimes there's inclusion in terms of music and art, but it's really breathing the air. It's not looking at these kids and saying, well, what can you do? And let's focus on that, and let's focus on putting you in society first based on that so you can be successful, so your peers can see you be successful, and that fosters that acceptance, that fosters that understanding, right? And so we don't do that. When children start kindergarten, neurotypical is kind of the phrase that people like or don't like, but when they start kindergarten, we kind of look at these kids and say, oh, well, little Johnny is really good at reading, and little Susie's really good at math, and we start kind of encouraging them. We still teach them everything, but we start encouraging them. When kids with disabilities start the school, we draft this IEP document, this, with all this information about how we're going to help them, and we look at all of the things they can't do. We spend all of our time focusing on that, and we don't say, well, what can this kid do? Well, let's start focusing on that, because somebody with a disability who may have more limited paths to, being in society, you really need to focus on their strengths, even more than somebody else, like, who might have multiple strengths. But we don't do that. We look at all the things they can't do, and then if they continue to not be able to do it, we just keep pulling them out more and more to try to fix them. And we don't give them opportunities to develop their strengths. And I think it's really because we still don't look at disability as diversity. So we don't look at disability as strength. We look at it as a medical model and a charity model. You guys can't do what we can do, so how do we help you get there?
So I'm going to throw a name out to you. Albert Einstein,
right?
Do we go, that guy who was dyslexic?
Yeah.
The smart one who was dyslexic. No, it's like Albert Einstein was not, we don't think of him as a diagnosis, even if he was a dyslexic. He was brilliant. And there are many brilliant people who have a range of things that we would consider.
We need to expand the definition of brilliance too, right? Like in the workforce, we need to stop looking at brilliance in our narrow box of, can we hang out with them? Can we chat with them? Can they communicate? Can we do this? Maybe we can look and say, all right, like I'll give you my son as another example. Putting the music aside, he's brilliant at cataloging. And a lot of kids on the spectrum are, right? So when he's looking at a job, can they say, this kid is brilliant at cataloging, his memory is off the charts. We need data analysis. Let's put him there. This kid is good at that. We don't do that.
Because he can discern patterns.
He can discern patterns, he can memorize things. We'll be driving down the road like on 10 miles from Tyson's, and he'll point over there and said, I played a gig there on December 12th, 2014, and he'll be right.
And isn't that amazing? But why don't people see that as, you're right, brilliance. Like,
brilliance.
Brilliant.
And ability, and say, from a young age, because he could do that from a young age and say, all right, how do we foster this? How do we train this?
And where do we put that ability in the workplace? Where it's needed, where it's valued.
But instead, the schools don't really look at the long-term workforce. I mean, the whole purpose of education is to create productive citizens. But with kids with disabilities, they don't think of them as productive citizens. Again, it's that lack of thought of the normative part of human experience. Kids with disabilities, they're not productive citizens like little Johnny and little Susie, so how do we get them to be like little Johnny and little Susie? Instead of saying, well, maybe their productive citizen is little Jakey.
Right.
And it's not with little Johnny and little Susie, but it's still part of that diversity and still valuable. And if we started flipping the conversation to where is their diversity, where is their ability, and how do we foster that, I think we would reduce this unemployment rate. I think we would reduce the need for social services. And I think we would actually, as a society, benefit from hearing the voices and seeing the experiences and being surrounded by the beautiful diversity that people with disabilities bring to the table.
And one thing that we will touch on, and we'll expand on it a little more in our next segment as well, is that disability is the one category that all of us have the potential to be in.
Exactly.
Right? Either temporarily or permanently, and especially with age.
Yeah, or we're all one car accident away from, and that's the point I made at Netroots when I said, you guys have one panel on disability, you keep pointing to healthcare as the conversation, right? But the reality is, currently, right now, 1 in 6 people in this country have a disability. 1 in 6. that's huge.
It is.
And tomorrow you could be one of them. Maybe you are, I don't know. But, you know, but tomorrow I could be one of them. It's the one category we could all belong part of, so we should all want to look at our society as including the person we might be someday.
So I'll throw another name out at you, Stephen Hawking.
Right?
Stephen Hawking. So was he defined by his disability? People knew he was in a wheelchair. He lost his ability to speak, to move, but he did not lose the processing, his mind, his thoughts, his ability to think and to write.
But you know what's interesting? After he died, there was this meme that went on the internet. I don't know if you saw it. And it was this meme of Stephen Hawking standing out of his wheelchair, walking kind of towards the sky, like he's finally freed in death.
Yes.
You know, and people in the disability community were actually really angry about this meme because the implication was that his wheelchair was holding him back, and maybe it was
to a certain
extent, but he wasn't. He was still a brilliant scientist. He still did all these amazing discoveries.
He still wrote books.
He still wrote books.
He appeared. He appeared on stage. He appeared on panels.
So instead of seeing his amazing ability as seeing the disability as part of his amazing ability, our society said, oh, he's finally freed of that horrible condition. If you think of something as a horrible condition, you're never going to accept it as part of diversity. Right? We used to think of that, of women and people of color as lesser than. Right? You look at our Constitution.
Right.
It's written in the Constitution.
Yeah, 3/5 of a person.
3/5 of the person, right? And if we keep looking at disability as lesser than, we are never going to look at disability as ability, and we're never going to flip the conversations in our workplaces, in our societies, of these people belong here like everybody else, and why do we not look at them like we do everybody else? And why do we accept a 65% unemployment? Why do we accept lower than minimum wage? Like, oh, look, we're paying you a penny. Aren't you happy?
Yeah, I mean, some workers with disability, and you know, Vermont is the first state to have eliminated shelter workshops.
Yes.
Eliminated them. New Hampshire and Maryland have eliminated substandard wages for people with...
But they still have the shelter, which is, I don't mind the shelter workshops because there are people who have different needs of support in a workplace, just like the rest of us.
Right.
But if people are going to do the work, they need to get paid.
They need to be paid.
They need to be paid.
Yeah.
Because now we're looking at the charity. We're going to give you a few pennies, but we're going to make sure, we'll take care of your housing, maybe. It's a charity model, as opposed to you were doing work and you get paid for the work you do.
Right. And so when we return from this next break, we're going to be talking about some of the amazing people who are doing advocacy on their own behalf. One of them is Kayla McKeon, who actually advocates on Capitol Hill. There was an article recently in The Hill about Kayla and the fact that she learned to read so that she could learn to drive. She lives in Syracuse, New York. She flies down here to work as a lobbyist on Capitol Hill to eliminate sub-minimum wage for people with disabilities. That's just one example of many of how we need to understand what people who have disabilities bring to the table. Please join us after the break.
This is the story of a boy who is very sensitive to lights and sounds. So he built secret hiding places where nothing could get in. The boy didn't like looking people in the eye. It made him feel uncomfortable. One day, he found out he had something called autism. His family got him help, and slowly, he learned how to live with it better.
Early intervention can make a lifetime of difference. Learn the signs at autismspeaks.org.
What do you think you're doing, Kevin?
Was just gonna drive home.
There are several warning signs present that you shouldn't be driving.
Like hearing voices?
Like your text-to-emoji ratio?
Oh man, the selfies.
Selfie. Nailed it.
We all have warning signs that let us know that we're probably not okay to drive. Mine is pretending to be your subconscious.
Craig, come on man, let's split a ride home.
Being a dad is an adventure full of special moments.
A cruise?
Surprise! Unexpected moments.
I got this.
And even awkward moments.
Okay, Dad, thank you.
But every moment you spend with your kids, even the smallest moments, can make the biggest impact on your child's life. So take a moment to be a dad today.
So, I'm kind of new here, but I've noticed a trend. My human does this funny thing where she goes around and gets all my toys, and then she hides them in that basket by the door. You know, but it's always the same basket, and it's always in the same place. And then she acts so surprised when I find them, but, you know, she's putting him in the same basket. Again. It's like, hello, that's where you put it last time. You were the worst at hide and go seek.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Tonight we're talking about ability-focused inclusion for people with disabilities. And joining me is Rachna Sizemore Heizer, talking about the many ways in which we need to be focused on a rights model of inclusion.
Well, and that's, when we talked about it, I mentioned the charity model, which is how can we help you? It's very kind of demeaning and patronizing. We talk about the medical model, which is your disability is the problem, so how do we fix it? And we talk about the social model, which is we as society with our stereotypes and preconceived notions and kind of low expectations disable the person more than their actual condition. The rights model is the model we use for every other condition of diversity, right? We want equal rights, we want civil rights.
Human rights,
civil rights, equal rights for people, color, LGBT, but we don't really use those words when we talk about disability. Or if we do, we still then defer to the healthcare. Healthcare is a human right. Well, it is, but for a person, right? Let's put the person with disability aside. What I want in my life is I want to have friends, I want to have a spouse, I want to have a family, I want to have a job, I want to go out and not feel like I'm going to be arrested for just existing. That's all human rights and civil rights, and people have a right to live as they are. And that's the conversation with disability we need to have, right? And people need to have the right to be able to advocate as they can, or have someone advocate for them, right? Like you mentioned Kayla, who's this amazing advocate with Down syndrome, right? And she flies down and she's a lobbyist and she's working on getting rid of sub-minimum wage, and that's fantastic. And I know a young man named Connor Cummings who has autism, and if you see a young man with Mickey Mouse ears, that's Connor.
That's right, that's how people know Connor. That's his brand.
That's his brand, and it's because he loves Disney, and he's very proud of wearing his Disney ears. And when you talk about, again, the societal model, his sort of statement is, how is my wearing Mickey Mouse ears at the age of 20-something any different than you wearing your favorite baseball team or football team's baseball hat?
So true, true.
That's kind of his statement. Why is what I'm doing with Mickey Mouse ears considered weird, and you with your, Redskins hat considered fine?
Right.
And that goes back to the social model. Neither one of them should be wrong, right? But Connor is, he's on the autism spectrum, and he does a lot of advocacy, but he can't do, sort of extemporaneous speech. So he has to write it out himself, and then he reads it out loud. And that's a way of advocating. But, I think sometimes in the disability community, we talk about, well, we need people with disabilities to speak for themselves, and that's who we need to hear from. And I 100% believe that is true, because the person who is, who is that condition, who is that diversity, should speak. But we have to be careful with disabilities to limit it to that, because that's being, as the word is, ableist, as the rest of us not including disabilities. Because disabilities are a spectrum. Like this woman, Kayla, with Down syndrome, she obviously is capable of communicating, of speaking, of lobbying. But there are people with Down syndrome who are much more language limited and communication limited. My own son with autism, there's some people with autism, like Temple Grandin, who's this famous scientist with autism, goes out and gives speeches and writes books. Well, my son doesn't have that language to do that. But he still deserves to have a voice, whether that voice is through me or for him through his music, or a combination. Like, he's 16, right? Right. What does a 16-year-old boy want? A girlfriend.
Of course.
Right? And he desperately wants a girlfriend. And so school's starting, and he wants to ask his friend Cecilia to homecoming. And he doesn't have the language to really build a relationship and ask her to homecoming, but he's a brilliant musician. So here's what he's done. He's taken the Simon and Garfunkel song, Cecilia, and he's reworked it to put in the phrase, Cecilia, come to homecoming with me, within the song. He's taught himself the song on the guitar and lyrics, and now he's planning, on Wednesday, by the way, to sing this song for her as his way of asking her to homecoming. That's how he communicates. But he can't write a song. He's not capable of writing complete, spontaneous lyrics.
Not yet.
For everything, not yet.
Not yet.
But for everything that affects him as a human condition, he can't.
Right, so he has to adapt.
He has to adapt.
With the skills that he has.
With the skills that he has, but we have to be willing to let other people speak for him. Like, I'll give you an example. Today he went to school he gets his schedule early, and he tours around the school so he knows where all his classes are, so when he starts school, he's comfortable. Well, I sent him to school on his own to do that today. He's been there for several years. But I was concerned because not all the teachers know him, the school resource officer's there, and I thought, what if somebody stops him as he's wandering the school before school starts with a little piece of paper in his hand and starts questioning him?
And he can't answer.
And he can answer, but he can't really explain what he's doing. What if they then call the police? I mean, here I am in his own school that he's been at. This is his 4th year there. And that's my concern. So I wrote a little note for him to hand to somebody that said, my name is Jake, blah, 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 blah. I have autism. I'm just doing this. Right, and I said, read this. If somebody comes up to you don't know, read this. I shouldn't have to do that.
I know.
But he should have the right to have me be able to give him those words or say them for him because he can't say them for himself. And we shouldn't say, you have to be able to speak for you to advocate. We should value all of the ways people with disabilities communicate, whether it's through another person, whether it's through themselves, whether it's through music, and we should listen to that. And that's what I think we don't do, right? We look at the very, very high communication ability people, and we think that represents the scope. And that
we even do that with non-disabled people.
We do.
People who are verbal tend to be the ones who are more successful than the people who are shy or introverted or whatever. They're judged to be somehow lesser, even on the normative spectrum.
It is, but it's even,
we value verbal communication skills.
But we really need, in our society, to accept there is a broad spectrum of skills, and where do we fit people with those skills? And we need to start it in our schools, and we need to start it together in the same room, right? And we need, if they don't find it in kindergarten, we have to stop dismissing them in 1st grade, and then stop dismissing them in 2nd grade, and we have to stop resegregating them when they get to middle school. Because this is what happens when they get to middle school, is we start pulling electives for kids with disabilities, right? We say, oh, you're not good at math, let's give you 2 math classes. Oh, you're not good at reading, let's give you 2 reading classes, and all of a sudden, any chance they have
no
discovering an ability.
No band, no art,
no
theater, whatever,
But no way of discovering what they might be good at. We pull all that stuff, and we need to find a way to listen and see ability in our workplaces. We need a way to see ability. There's a story of a kid with Down syndrome who was bagging groceries at the grocery store, right? And one of my things I always say is that we as society need to stop patting ourselves on the back for the fact that people bag groceries at a grocery store with a disability. Because while that's a great job and that might be perfect for some people, we seem to have this opinion that if someone with a disability is bagging groceries, that is the be-all and end-all, and look how awesome we are.
Right.
Right.
And we don't look at their potentiality or what they're capable of or what they're interested in or anything.
Well, this young man had memorized everybody's work schedule, had memorized all of the stocking needs and all the needs in the store, and had refigured it out in his own head to figure out what would be more efficient. But yet he was bagging groceries, and he would say, well, maybe we should do this. And they all kind of dismissed him because he had Down syndrome and he was a grocery bagger. And that's all he was capable of doing.
See, that's such a huge blind spot.
It is.
And it brings up something else when I posted the story about Kayla and the fact that she was working as a lobbyist. Somebody on the comment thread said, well, there are all kinds of disincentives for people working who have, and this is the medical model.
Yeah,
right?
it is.
The medical model. So
it's
if
actually
you earn
the
too much,
model.
The charity model. So if you earn too much money, then you don't get the supports that help you to get a job so that...
Well, that's the worst, right? So there are people, cerebral palsy is a prime example of this, right? There are people with cerebral palsy who have a lot of physical limitations, right? Wheelchair bound, sometimes they need some home health aids for dressing and personal care. But they're very capable of doing a variety of jobs, right? But to get the home health care or to get the personal aid to help with dressing and some of the functions of life, they need Medicaid, right? And to get that, you have to have below a certain income. And it's a very low income. So we're basically disincentivizing these people from working.
Which is crazy.
Which is crazy because then you lose your home health care. I mean, some of the Medicaid services come with job coaching. Kids on the autism spectrum sometimes need that job coaching, sort of that social coaching. They need much more direct, like my son needs much more direct instruction. He can do things, but you have to kind of instruct him. But we're saying, all right, if you make less than a certain amount of money, we're going to give you these supports. That includes job coaching. If you start making too much money, we're going to take the job coaching away. Well, maybe you're successful in your job because you've had the job coaching. Maybe you still need the touch-in. Maybe you need the personal care.
And this is the craziest
Isn't that crazy?
thing of all. And the other thing, too, is that we immediately associate someone with a disability to being relegated to low-wage work.
We do.
Which is the other crazy thing. It's kind of like all this sub-minimum wage, and you can't make over a certain extent, or your Medicaid supports are pulled, and it's like...
The number of times I've heard people tell me, oh, yeah, we go to Giant, oh, I love all those kids with disabilities, or I'm like, really, that's the only thing you can think of? Like, there's a young man in my neighborhood who's on the autism spectrum, and he does web design, but he works as a janitor. And because he's on the spectrum, he actually got a job doing more computer type work, but he didn't have the job coaching support and had some issues understanding instructions, got fired and is working as a janitor, but he can do IT tech work. So maybe instead of that company saying, well, you can't do the work like these people can, so therefore we're going to fire you, maybe some coaching for that company of how do we give direct instruction. I mean, that's what I do for the workforce training.
Right.
Right, it's simple stuff. Break down task lists, more direct instruction, a peer buddy. These aren't expensive supports. They're actually good management techniques.
Right, right. They are for team building.
For team building.
Inclusiveness in the workplace. I mean, yes.
Yeah, and this young man could have been very successful doing IT work, and he was doing well with the IT work if his boss had had a little bit more training on how to be inclusive of somebody with a disability on the autism spectrum who needs a little more clear, concise instructions.
So that's the thing I think we need to figure out a way to reach into existing businesses to help them up their commitment to a more inclusive workplace, because, you know, the tech, oh, we need more women, and we need more diversity. And again, they're thinking of diversity as we need to check off boxes to make sure that we have an inclusive workplace, but they're not looking at disability as one of those.
Some of the tech companies are starting to get better. There was a big autism conference in Seattle that was held. But even some of them, well, they're getting better. Like I worked with one, and it kind of cracked me up. They were all very proud of their autism intern program, and it was fantastic. They had an intern program that was 30 kids on the spectrum were going to come in and work for the summer. And I said, so how do you find the kids? How do you select them? What's your process? And they said, well, we first do a phone interview. And I said,
again, so it skews to people who are verbal.
Verbal and also very, very high functioning. And I'm like, well, did you ever think about offering a variety of interview types, a phone or an IM, or because sometimes people on the spectrum are much better with writing than they are.
Right, like Connor would be better with writing.
Connor would be much better if you had the question, you could read it, think about it, and answer, as opposed to being expected to do spontaneous conversation. Right, and they had 2 rounds of phone interviews and then a panel interview, and I said, this is not a process that is open to the variety of people on the autism spectrum. And that's just one example. And there are some companies that are starting to do alternative job interviews, taking out personality tests, but these are gateway stop-its. And right at the gate, we're stopping kids who have a lot of ability from getting in the door because they don't talk like you and me.
Yeah.
Right, but we also need to be careful to dismiss the people who don't talk like you and me, instead of finding creative ways to hear their stories. And that's, in the advocacy world, I think sometimes we are too focused on, we have to only have people with disabilities speak for themselves. And I think that should be the first round. We've got to be careful not to do it all the time.
I agree with you. And I think that the other thing we have to figure out how to do is to bring on board people who are in positions to make these decisions to help them. Just like we need to support people with disabilities, we need to support employers and people who create jobs and have jobs and hire people. So when we come back from this break, we will talk with Rachna a little bit more about how we do that.
So I just moved in with this family, and it's embarrassing. The little one, he likes to go outside and crawl around in the giant litter box. I don't know what he's doing. I mean, I was born and I knew how to use the litter box. Look at that. That's disgusting. Oh, poop already. You're making me nervous. Oh, okay, I can't look at this anymore. I really hope he grows out of this, for his sake.
So how was work?
It was 1,300 hours. My math class from 302 was in the trenches. Davy Roth had it the worst. Fractions were coming at him left and right. He just didn't get the damn things. 2 days ago, I tried to teach him what 1/4 of 1/2 was using different sizes of blocks. Yesterday, I tried again by dividing up pizza. Both missions failed.
Oh, no.
But today, I was ready. I created a combat math game where the only way to beat the enemy is to out-fraction them. Davy conquered every last denominator. My game was so successful, the principal is deploying it to math squadrons all over the school. Anywho, how was your day?
Oh, today my boss treated the office to salad wraps.
Salad wraps.
I know.
150 over 90. 180 over 111.
160 over 110. I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure looks like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from invisible or silent. If you've come off your treatment plan, get back on it, or talk with your doctor to create an exercise, diet, and medication plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
If I would have followed a treatment plan, I would not be in this situation.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. We are talking about ability-focused inclusion for people with disabilities tonight. And joining me is Rachna Sizemore Heizer, who has a lot of experience. She has a son on the autism spectrum. But more than that, you do coaching and training for employers and in workforce development that is inclusive.
It is, and so I'm a lawyer by trade, and I was an employment lawyer, and I did training on ADA and EEOC accommodations, and I realized as I started doing my training that in the workforce, when we talk about accommodations, we talk about sort of physical disabilities and how to accommodate people who might be blind or visually impaired and people in wheelchairs. And those are all, again, very important conversations. But there was no understanding of kind of the fastest growing disability population, which is behavioral neurological disabilities. And how do we really accommodate so that not just that they're in the workforce, but successful in the jobs? And as I started doing a training on neurodiversity and accommodations, you started with the, clear tasks and this and all these very specific accommodations, and I realized, whoa, I got all these blank stares at people going, well, why do I need to do that? I don't understand. And I realized there wasn't even an understanding of what the disability is. Like, we can see somebody in a wheelchair or somebody who's visually impaired and say, all right, well, they probably can't do this as well as I can because they're in a wheelchair. They can't climb stairs. It's kind of a prime example.
But if you said Asperger's to an employer, yeah. But Asperger's, because people with Asperger's tend to be more high functioning, in some cases, people with a disability don't necessarily present immediately as having a disability.
And that's one of the biggest issues actually with workforce accommodations is that you don't know who to give it to. And people with kind of mental health and behavioral disabilities, there's such a stigma around it, right? Like I talked about the police officer where the kid is arrested for existing, that people are afraid of saying it. And so what I do with my training is I talk about how do we make a workplace culture that is open and accepting and changed, so it's a workplace culture that accepts people with disabilities. In the same way we frankly had to do it in our schools and in our workplaces when we desegregated.
True.
We had to change the culture to,
we had to get rid of the white-only water fountains and the segregated bathrooms.
But even the mentality that came with that, there was a mentality that came with white-only bathrooms and whatever it was okay. That mentality had to be gone away. And that's the same thing with people with behavioral disabilities in the workplace. We need a ability-focused mentality, right? Not you can't talk like me, you can't do this like me, but what can you do and how do you do it well? Well, maybe you need a quiet space, maybe you need headphones, maybe you need flexible work schedule. How do you do what you do well? And we don't do enough of that in thinking about it, and it's because we don't understand. And then we also judge the stimming or the echolalia, and so people are getting fired for violating social norms, talking to themselves, and violating social norms. There's a young man I know in the Virginia Beach area who was working at Home Depot. He's helping people load carts up and carrying to the cars. He got fired not because he dinged up a car or dropped merchandise, but because he was talking too much. It's on the spectrum, and people didn't understand why he was talking too much. And I'm like, there's no reason that kid should have been fired. Right. So that's the training I do, is how do we have a culture of neurodiversity where some of this is just accepted, and people without the disability just say that's just Joey or Johnny or whoever. And that has to start in the schools. Right. The reason I've been such a focused proponent of inclusion in the schools and strengths-focused inclusion, in fact, I did a training at the Fairfax County Special Ed Conference, literally on strengths-focused and special interest-focused inclusion, and flipping the conversation of saying instead of including people when they act like us, we need to include people when they act like themselves. Right. And we need to change our culture. And we need to get rid of our stereotypes. I'll tell you a story of my son. My son, who's this brilliant musician, did strings in 4th grade, typical strings, right? And we get to the end of the school year, and the strings teacher calls me up and says he can't be in the concert. Now, this is a 4th grade strings concert in a elementary school cafeteria or whatever it is. And I said, why not? She's like, well, he can be in it as long as one of you sits next to him. And I said, well, why? And she said, well, you know, because he's got autism. I said, I don't know how to play strings. Like, what am I going to do sitting next to him?
Take the bow and do it.
Take the bow. And she had this preconceived notion that because he had autism, the change of environment from the typical strings class to this, you know, cafeteria with parents there and a stage and all this stuff was going to freak him out, and he'd go running and ruin the 4th grade strings concert, even though he had not done any of that the whole year. And that's what I mean by changing the culture.
Right.
We need to focus on this kid can play strings, this kid can program a computer, and we're not going to worry about our stereotypes and preconceived notions until we have a reason to.
So what happened with the strings concert?
So, you know, we argued and this and that, and they wouldn't let him do it. And so Craig, my husband, sat next to him during the strings concert, right? But it was interesting. That was 4th grade, and another preconceived notion, we talk about ability, focus, inclusion. He was in the segregated autism class because his language is very limited. And the first year he was there, this is a 4th through 6th grade class, he comes home at the end of the day and he says, I want to be in the talent show. And I'm like, what talent show? What are you talking about? Well, they had a talent show at the last day of school for an assembly, and he had seen it and wanted to be in it. And, you know, and I'm like, well, I don't know anything about this. My daughter didn't go to the school. How do I find out? So in the fall, I asked the teacher, well, how do you get in the talent show? And she said, well, they have to audition. I said, well, I didn't see any flyer come home about audition. She said, oh, it wasn't sent to the kids in the autism class.
You know, that is just unbelievable. What has to change are not the kids.
It's not the kids.
Culture of the schools, the culture of the workplaces, our expectations, and what we consider normative.
What we consider normative, right? And you know, and to be honest, like, this kid is brilliant. At age 11, like 2 years later, he was playing on the mall in front of 5,000 people, and you know, 2 years after that, he was auditioning on Broadway. And yet, because he was in this class, the presumption was he was incapable of having a talent that could be in an elementary school talent show.
So he was denied the opportunity.
Yeah, you know, and so that's what I think we do with people with disabilities. We deny them the opportunity because they don't fit in our box of normal. Their skills may not, their abilities may not immediately present because their disability may be more prominent. And we start that in our schools, right? We look at their disability, they can't talk, they can't read, they can't blah, blah, blah. We're going to work on all that, and we get them in the middle and high school when they might have a chance to explore an area of ability, auto tech, you know, all these technical skills that are actually needed in the workforce and lacking, and we don't let them pursue that because we're afraid of putting them in a typical class. We're afraid of them failing. We're afraid of the other kid's reaction. We're afraid that the kid won't be able to do it. And so what ends up happening is they can't do it. And they graduate, and the employers don't know what to do with them because they don't have these skills.
So they bag groceries.
And meanwhile, you know, the kid's in his head is redoing the whole configuration of the grocery store. This other kid can program a computer, but they bag groceries. And we need to start, this is what I talked about in my training for Fairfax, the special ed conference, we need to flip the conversation. In schools, we need to flip it in our workplaces, we need to flip it in our society, how do we look at a person's strengths and develop that while still providing the accommodations needed for the disability. But it should be, how do we do the strengths first? What are they? How do we find them? How do we look for them? And then, while we're working on that, how do we do this? So my son is a prime example. You put him in strings, you give him a chance to audition for the talent show, you put him in band, you have him there, and then you still have him in the segregated autism class for his academics. And that's where he is now. And you know, when he was in 8th grade, he was in all self-contained academic classes, but he was one of 2 8th graders in the most advanced guitar ensemble.
Right?
And that's how it should be for all of these kids. And if we do that, and if we go to the workforce and we do, one of the things that hit me when I was doing my workforce training was diversity training is a big buzzword and has been for like 5-10 years in the workforce, right? There's conferences on diversity training.
Right.
I went to a conference on diversity training. You know what they didn't talk about in the diversity training? I'll give you one word to guess. Disability.
Wow, okay.
There was no talk of disability as diversity in these trainings. And so the diversity trainings focuses on workplace culture. Disability accommodations focuses on accommodations.
That's make that point again, because I want everybody to follow what you're saying.
So disability training focuses on inclusion. diversity training focuses on inclusion, on workplace culture, of inclusivity.
Finding ways.
Being
intentional, going out, reaching out, making sure that you've given opportunities to everybody.
It's based on valuing people for who they are. We value African Americans, we value people, Muslims, value immigrants, we value women. It's a diverse viewpoint. Well, people on the autism spectrum, their memory is phenomenal. People, again, these are stereotypes, but you see it. There are strengths of people with ADHD, people with dyslexia, people with autism. We don't value those strengths. When we look at disability training, we talk about accommodations. How do we fix or help you? We don't talk about how do we value you? How do we see your value? And how do we take your value and change our world so that your value is also valued in our world?
That it's welcomed, that we make a space for you.
We make a space for you.
And also helping an individual to be successful, to reach their maximum potential.
Yeah.
Like, what have we thrown away in this country by not providing a place for people to be brilliant in their way?
Exactly. I mean, Stephen Hawking is the prime example, right? Would Stephen Hawking have been Stephen Hawking if he started with a disability?
True. Good question.
That's always my question, right? If he was in a wheelchair in school
and couldn't speak,
or maybe let's say he could speak, but he's still in a wheelchair, or let's say, and he was in these segregated classes, or couldn't speak as well, or needed a communication device to speak, which a lot of people are non-verbal, but they communicate through communication and communicate very well.
Right.
What if he needed a communication device to speak? One of the things that happens in schools right now is they provide communication devices to some of these children, but they don't actually provide the modeling and the training to teach the kids how to fully use them. And studies show communication devices are learning a second language. And you have to train them like you're teaching them Spanish or Korean or any other second language they don't already speak. But we don't do that in our schools. We look at the communication device as a very basic communication, as opposed to, this is how this person speaks, and that's normal. So if this is their normative way of speaking, their speech can be and should be as rich as my speech or your speech.
Right.
And we don't do that in the schools, and we don't do that in our workplaces. But with Stephen Hawking and the way he communicated and in the wheelchair, be Stephen Hawking if he started that way in school.
That is such an excellent question. And that's one that I hope all of our viewers are going to ask themselves as they look around in their children's classrooms as we head back to school, but looking around your workplace.
Yeah, your workplace.
Look around your workplace and say, how could my office or my company accommodate or cultivate or create a path of success for someone who has a disability?
And how do we change our culture so that's just part of the norm?
Well, I want to thank you so much. You have added so much to my understanding, as you do every time we speak.
Thank you.
You add to my understanding of what it means to truly be inclusive and to make a place for people of all abilities, differing abilities, all abilities. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the platform to talk.